The water clung to her skin in the fading light, catching on the dark bruise that bloomed across her shoulder. She stood waist-deep in the creek, hair slicked against her back, moving as if each gesture was a prayer. John Merrick had seen the river hold driftwood, deer, even a dead man once, but never a woman who looked like she belonged to none of them. She didn't know he was there, or if she did, she gave no sign. Her hands moved slowly through the water, cupping it, letting it fall again, like she was washing away something more stubborn than dust. The creek ran quiet this time of year, its edges frozen in shadow, but the ripples around her seemed to carry their own kind of heat. A moment earlier, John had been in the yard, splitting wood. The sun was low, the wind sharp, and the work steady, until a sound broke it. Not the sudden crash of a branch or the frantic scramble of deer hooves, but a softer rhythm. Water moving where it shouldn't be. He straightened, listening, an old habit that came from living too far from anyone else to expect visitors. His axe hung loose in his grip. He called out once, loud enough to carry. No answer, so he followed. Now, hidden in the shadow of cottonwoods, he stood looking down the bend. The bruise caught his eye again, deep, ugly, the kind that didn't come from a fall. He told himself to turn away. A man living alone didn't invite trouble, and trouble often came wearing a face you didn't expect. But something in her stillness held him there. Grief knows its own shape, and he saw some of his in her. She turned her head then, just enough for their eyes to meet across the water. No startle, no scream, only a look that said she'd already seen worse than this, worse than him. They stayed like that, the creek whispering between them. Then, without a word, she stepped backward toward the bank, never breaking her gaze. John nodded once, not claiming her, not dismissing her, and walked back the way he'd come. He didn't look over his shoulder. Whatever passed between them didn't need to be caught twice. By the time he reached the yard, the wind had picked up, carrying the smell of snow. He set the axe aside, lit the lamp in the front window. It was a habit he'd left behind years ago, after the fire took his wife and son. Tonight it returned without asking. He told himself it was just for him, a light against the early dark, but deep down he knew better. Out here, a lamp in the window was a message, not a welcome, not a promise, just a sign that the world wasn't entirely closed. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. The verse came to him unbidden, same as the lamp had. He stood there a moment longer, watching the glass glow against the night before turning inside. Somewhere beyond the cottonwoods, the creek kept running. Whether she'd seen the light or not, he couldn't say. But for the first time in years, he left it burning long past midnight. Morning broke pale and cold, the kind that made the frost cling stubbornly to fence rails long after the sun came up. John stepped out with his coffee, the steam twisting away into the crisp air. Across the yard, the barn door stood half open. Movement inside, just a shadow passing across the gap, told him she hadn't gone. He didn't go to her right away. Letting a stranger keep their space was as much courtesy as it was caution. He made his round first, checked the mare, scattered feed for the hens, stacked the wood he'd split the day before. When he finally did glance toward the barn, she was there, standing just outside, shawl in hand. That's when he saw it. As she lifted the fabric over her shoulders, the morning light caught bare skin for an instant. The bruise was worse than it had looked from the cottonwoods, a dark, spreading bloom against pale flesh. Not an accident, not the kind of mark the land leaves. She didn't see him watching, or maybe she did, but didn't care. Her face didn't change. Only her shoulders shifted slightly, like she was bracing against more than the cold. John walked over, stopping far enough away to keep the air easy between them. "Barn's warmer than the open," he said, voice low. "I can bring more blankets. Bucket of water, too. She paused, then gave the smallest nod. Not thanks, not agreement, just a sign she'd heard him. That was enough. Back inside, he reached for an old wool blanket from the shelf. That's when he noticed the drawer in the kitchen sideboard left ajar. Inside, half buried under yellowed receipts and a jar of nails, lay a creased sheet of paper. He pulled it free. It was a wanted notice, edges curled, ink faded but still clear enough. Clara Wynne, charged as an accomplice to armed robbery, last seen with Matthew Kane. A rough sketch of her face stared back at him, harder around the eyes than the woman outside. John stood there a long moment, reading the words again. Out here, $200 was a winter's survival, repairs to the roof, enough feed to carry the mare through spring. He thought about the bruise, about the way she hadn't flinched at the creek. Then he folded the paper in half and stepped outside. She was leaning against the barn wall, watching the sky. He held the notice out, plain in his hand. "Found this in a drawer," he said. "You can tell me about it or not." Her eyes dropped to the paper, then back to his. She didn't move to take it, didn't explain. The silence stretched between them, not hostile, but weighted. Finally, John tucked the paper into his coat pocket. "Blankets inside, help yourself," he said, and turned away. The rest of the day passed without crossing paths again. Toward evening, he went to the yard to fix the loose hinge on the chicken coop. The hammer he kept by the post was missing. He frowned, checked the workbench, the porch. Then he spotted it leaning against the barn door. The handle had been reset, wrapped neatly in fresh leather. Tight, clean work. He picked it up, turned it over in his hand. The balance felt right again, better than before. No note, no words, just the hammer. He stood there a while, leather cool in his grip, and something eased inside him. It wasn't trust, not yet, but it was the start of a thing that might grow if given the chance. Back inside, he set the hammer on the workbench and lit the lamp again. Same place as the night before. Same quiet glow against the dark. Whether she saw it or not, he couldn't say. But some acts didn't need to be seen to matter. If you found this helpful, a quick like really helps us keep creating. The morning wind carried the sharp bite of snow from the high ridge. John stepped out to the yard, breath fogging, coffee in hand. The barn door was shut tight, no sign of Clara moving inside. He figured she was still sleeping off the cold from her nights on the trail. By mid-morning, he'd fed the mare, mended the hinge on the chicken coop, and hauled 2 pails from the creek. On the way back, he noticed the stillness. Not the easy kind, but the kind that seemed to press against the air. He set the pails down and pushed the barn door open. She was there, curled on the blanket he'd given her, hair damp with sweat. The shawl lay twisted on the ground, her breathing shallow, skin too pale. Fever had her in its grip, the slow-burning kind that could turn deadly before nightfall. John crouched beside her, touched the back of his fingers to her cheek. Heat, the kind he knew from winters when sickness took neighbors before help could ride in from town. He straightened, glanced toward the house. He had one room that stayed warm through the night without a stove. But that room hadn't been opened in 4 years. The hallway inside felt colder than the wind outside. He stopped at the door, fingers resting on the worn frame. His eyes traced the little carving above it. JDM, the initials of a boy who never made it past 6. Dust lay thick on the sill. The smell was the same as it had been the day he shut it. Faint pine from the quilt chest, old wood, and something else only memory carried. He closed his eyes. The verse came to him without summoning. God is our refuge and strength, a very present help in trouble. Psalm 46:1. The latch lifted with a sound he felt in his chest. He carried Clara in, careful as if she were made of glass. Her head lolled against his shoulder, breath hot on his neck. The bed was already made, quilt folded neat at the foot, the one his wife had pieced the winter before the fire. He laid her down, pulled the quilt over her, and set a cup of water on the small table. She stirred once, eyes half opening. There was no question in them, no startle, only the dull glaze of fever and the kind of surrender that comes when there's no fight left. "You'll be all right," he said, though he wasn't sure if she heard. The rest of the day passed in a rhythm John hadn't felt in years, moving between the stove and her bedside, swapping damp cloths for cool ones, listening to her breathing change with the hours. By late evening, the flush in her cheek softened, and her hand found the water he'd left without him having to guide it. He didn't speak of the room, and she didn't ask. When night came, he sat outside on the porch, coat drawn tight, watching the frost crawl along the rails. The coyotes sang far off, but the only sound that mattered was the steady rise and fall of breath from behind the wall. Somewhere deep in the night, he rose, checked the lamp in the window. It still burned. He didn't remember lighting it again, but there it was, casting a small circle of gold into the dark. The fever broke on the third morning. Clara stepped out onto the porch, shawl pulled close, her face still pale, but her eyes clearer. John was already there, boots on the rail, coffee steaming between his hands. She didn't ask to sit. She just eased herself down on the far end of the bench, moving carefully, as if the air might bruise her. For a long time, neither spoke. The horizon was painted in the faded colors of a Wyoming winter sunset. A thin band of gold, a wash of cold blue above it. John poured the last of the pot into her mug without asking. She took it with both hands, letting the steam rise into her face. They fell into that rhythm over the next weeks. Chores in the day, John with the fence line and the mare, Clara moving quietly around the kitchen, mending what was worn, sweeping the dust from corners he'd stopped noticing. Evenings on the porch, the air between them filled with the sounds of the land, the creek's low murmur, the wind combing through cottonwoods, the distant cry of a hawk. One night, the quiet stretched longer than usual before Clara broke it. "He used to bring me roses," she said, eyes on the dark beyond the yard. John didn't ask who. "Every time he messed up," she went on, "and he messed up a lot." Her voice was flat, the words worn smooth by time. "Said he loved me, right before the first time he hit me, and every time after." The coffee in John's mug cooled between his hands. "He told me it was my fault," she said, "that I made him do it, that I was the storm he had to tame." She took a slow sip, winced at the heat. "I ran when I saw him draw his gun, not for me, for the banker. Figured if he'd do that in daylight, he'd do worse come dark." Her hand rested briefly on her belly, almost without thought. "I don't know if this child is a gift or a burden," she whispered. John didn't answer. He stood, took the kettle from the hook over the fire pit, poured fresh water, and set it back. The flames caught, sending sparks into the night. When he returned to his seat, he didn't look at her. "Tea'll be ready soon," he said. She nodded, eyes still fixed on the dark. They didn't speak of it again that night. Instead, Clara pulled the shawl tighter, and John stoked the fire until the embers glowed deep red. Something in the silence between them shifted. Not forgiveness, not even understanding, but the kind of space where both could breathe without fear of judgment. The next evening, she set his coffee on the porch rail before he'd even come out, a small act that felt heavier than words. It wasn't just coffee. It was the first time she'd done something for him without it being necessary. He took it, nodding once, and they sat as they always did, watching the sky trade light for shadow, the quiet carrying more than any conversation could. The knock came just past noon, firm, deliberate, like the man on the other side wasn't in the habit of repeating himself. John set down the feed bucket and crossed the porch. When he opened the door, Sheriff Cole Hart stood there, hat in hand, his gray eyes already scanning the yard. "Afternoon, John," Hart said, voice steady as a fence post. "Sheriff." Hart stepped just inside, boots leaving faint prints on the plank floor. He didn't sit, but his gaze found the window with a clear view of the barn. "Heard someone spotted a woman near the South Ridge couple days back. Matches a name I've got reason to ask about." John kept his expression even. "Plenty of folks passing through these days." Hart's hand slid into his coat and came out with a folded sheet of paper. He laid it on the table the way a gambler lays down a final card. The wanted poster was worn but legible. "Clara Wynne, charged as an accomplice to armed robbery, last seen with Matthew Kane." "Reward's good," Hart said, almost casually. $200, enough to make winter easier." John's eyes dropped to the poster, then back to the sheriff. "She hasn't asked for money or mercy," he said, "only a place to rest." Hart studied him for a long moment. "You know of the company she kept, John?" "Kane's not the sort a decent woman ends up with by mistake." "Some folks don't run because they're guilty," John said. "They run because they're tired of being hunted." The sheriff's jaw shifted like he was weighing something heavier than the paper in his hand. He looked out the window again, then folded the poster and slipped it back into his coat. "She's still out at the barn?" he asked. Not like a demand, more like he already knew the answer. John didn't answer. Hart put his hat back on, settled it with a tug at the brim. "You take care, John." "I always do." The door closed with a whisper, not a slam. Outside, hooves met dirt, and the sound of the sheriff's horse faded toward town. John stood there a moment longer, the quiet of the house settling in around him. It didn't feel like relief, not exactly. More like the air had thickened with something that wasn't going to blow away easy. That evening, Clara set an extra plate on the table, just beside his usual seat. She didn't say it was for the sheriff, or that she'd heard the whole thing from the barn. But the gesture spoke clear enough. She knew he'd made a choice, and it wasn't the easy one. John didn't mention it either. Some things didn't need naming to be understood. It happened on a still Sunday, the kind where even the wind seemed to hold its breath. John was mending the south fence, the sun sharp in a cloudless sky, when he spotted a dust plume rising beyond the ridge. One rider, steady pace, not lost. He rested the hammer against the post and watched. Whoever it was rode like they owned the trail. By the time the rider came into view, John knew. Matthew Kane. The man swung down from his horse before the porch, boots hitting the ground with a weight that said he didn't plan on leaving empty-handed. "Where is she?" Kane's voice carried the rough edge of whiskey and old grudges. John walked up slow, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of his sleeve. "You're far from where your kind usually stirs trouble." Kane smirked without humor. "She's mine, ran off with something that belongs to me." "She's not yours," John said, voice calm as the still sky. Kane took a step closer, eyes narrowing. "A woman doesn't just walk away without reason, especially carrying my blood." Behind John, the screen door creaked. Clara stepped out onto the porch. Her hand gripped the frame, but she wasn't hiding. "I'm not yours," she said, her voice clear, carrying across the yard. "And if this child's yours, he deserves better than what you gave me." Kane froze, just for a breath, not expecting her to speak, certainly not like that. Then his face tightened, and he moved forward again. John stepped between them, his boots planted in the dirt, eyes locked on Kane's. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. "She's not going with you," John said. "One more step and you'll wish you'd turned back at the ridge." Kane's hand twitched toward his belt, not on the pistol, but close enough to send the air taut between them. The land itself seemed to wait. The door behind Clara opened wider. She stepped down, coming to stand beside John. Not behind, beside. "You think fear keeps people," she said to Kane. "You think pain makes us stay. You've got nothing left to offer me but the memory of your hands." Something in her tone, steady, final, cut deeper than any blade. Kane's smirk returned, but it didn't reach his eyes. He spat into the dust, turned, and mounted his horse. "You'll regret this," he muttered, more to himself than them, and rode off without another glance. They stood there until the dust cloud shrank against the horizon. Inside, nothing looked different. Outside, everything had changed. That night, Clara didn't cry. She swept the porch, tended the fire, folded the quilt from John's son's bed like it was armor she'd reforged. John fixed the broken latch on the front gate, each strike of the hammer a quiet declaration. No words passed between them. None were needed. The sun was bleeding out over the western ridge when John saw the rider. Tall in the saddle, steady in pace, no wasted motion. This wasn't a man chasing for sport. This was a man who measured his rides and what they'd bring him. John stayed on the porch, leaning against the post, as the horse slowed to a walk and stopped at the steps. The rider swung down, tied the reins, and stepped up like a man who'd already decided the ground was his. "Name's Wade Foster," he said, voice even, as if they were just trading weather. "Got business." From his coat he pulled a folded sheet of paper. John didn't need to open it. The weight of the ink was already familiar. "Clara Wynne, $200, alive. Some say she runs with Matthew Kane. Others say she's worse." John didn't take the paper. He just shifted enough for the door behind him to be in plain sight. Inside, Clara had stopped whatever she'd been doing. The quiet was different now, waiting quiet. Wade's gaze flicked past John to the yard, the barn, the windows. He didn't push past. He just stood there, holding that paper between two fingers. "I've been on the trail a long time," Wade said. "Seen all kinds. Some worth the rope, some worth the sell. But every once in a while—" His voice trailed off as he looked at the house. The small table by the window, a second mug drying on the rail, a shawl hanging near the fire. He unfolded the poster, held it to the dying light. Clara stepped into the doorway then, not flinching, not hiding. The bruises were gone now, but the set of her jaw was the same as that first day in the creek. Wade looked at her for a long time. Then, almost gently, he crumpled the paper. The sound was louder than the wind. He tossed it into the fire pit near the steps. Flames caught the edges, curling them inward until the ink dissolved into black ash. "Blessed are the merciful," Wade said quietly, almost like he was talking to himself, "for they shall receive mercy." Matthew 5:7. John didn't move. Clara didn't speak. Wade stepped back to his horse, loosened the reins. "Some things," he said, "ain't meant to be chased." He tipped his hat once, mounted, and rode toward the ridge, the sunset turning him into a shadow against the gold sky. Long after the sound of hoofbeats faded, John stirred the fire pit with the toe of his boot, watching the last bit of paper turn to ash. He didn't reach to scatter it. Some things deserved to vanish slow. Clara stepped out beside him, her gaze on the horizon where Wade had disappeared. Not with fear, not anymore. Something softer. Inside, the house was warm, the lamplight steady. She touched the doorframe as she passed in, the same one she'd leaned against weeks ago, bruised and uncertain. Now she entered like it belonged to her. Snow still clung to the north side of the cabin, but the creek had begun to show its edges again, ice breaking in thin, jagged lines. The wind had lost its bite, carrying more water in its scent than frost. John split the last of the heavy logs, stacking them under the eave where they'd stay dry. Clara was outside too, shawl pinned tight, mending a tear in one of the horse blankets. Every so often she paused, pressing a hand against the small of her back. She hadn't said much about the child in her belly, and John hadn't asked. But there was a different rhythm to the days now, a quiet shift in how they moved around each other. She'd started setting aside extra flour for bread, rinsing jars to hold whatever preserves they might put up come summer. He'd doubled the feed order for the mare, repaired the latch on the barn so it wouldn't stick come spring. One afternoon, she stepped into the barn to find him leaning over the workbench, smoothing a piece of wood with a draw knife. "What's that for?" she asked. He didn't look up. "Rocking chair," he said. "For the porch." "For the room." She didn't ask which room. They both knew. In the evenings, they sat together near the fire, the kettle always on, the light throwing long, slow shadows across the floorboards. Some nights she read aloud from the one book she'd found on his shelf, an old, worn Bible. She didn't read the genealogy or the long lines of law, just the Psalms and parables. Her voice softened on the verses, like she was turning them over in her mind. On other nights, they didn't speak at all. She'd mend or peel apples, and he'd oil the tools, both of them working in the quiet that no longer felt like a wall. One evening, she asked without looking up, "Do you think people can be made new?" He thought for a moment, the fire popping low. "I think some things take more time than we want," he said. "But yes, I've seen it happen." She nodded once, as if filing the answer away for later. By late February, the days stretched longer. Clara began hanging the wash outside again, though the wind still snapped at the wet cloth. John started clearing the path to the creek, chopping away ice so the buckets wouldn't slip from his hands. Neither of them spoke about Kane, the sheriff, or Wade Foster. It was as if those names had been left behind with the snowdrifts. But the memory of those days had left its mark in the way they looked at each other, steady, measuring, and without the wariness they'd both worn when she first arrived. One night, as they finished supper, Clara looked at the lamp in the window and then at him. "Not always," John said. "Not for a long time." She didn't press for more. She only reached over, adjusted the wick so the flame burned steady. And for the rest of the night, the lamp glowed like it had been lit for both of them. If you're still watching right now, drop a 1 in the comments so I know you're still with me on this journey. The wind had a bite to it that morning, the kind that stung the lungs and carried the scent of snow still stubborn in the shadows of the hills. John Merrick was stacking split logs by the porch when the sound reached him. Not the sharp crack of ice or the restless whinny of the mare, but a low, uneven breath from inside the cabin. He found Clara at the table, both hands gripping the edge hard enough to whiten her knuckles. Her face was pale, damp with a sheen of sweat that didn't belong to the cold. The dough she'd been kneading sagged forgotten beside her. "It's early," she said, though her voice trembled. John didn't answer. He'd seen enough to know that early didn't matter now. Out here, miles from any midwife, the choice was gone. The moment had come whether they were ready or not. He stoked the fire high, the heat licking up the chimney in a steady roar. In the back room, he dragged down a box from the high shelf. Linens folded by hands he hadn't held in years, clean but scented faintly of cedar and memory. A porcelain basin, the same one his wife had used when their boy was born, clinked softly as he set it on the table. He filled it with water from the kettle, steam curling like ghost breath into the air. When he passed her again, she caught his wrist, eyes searching his face as though looking for something solid to hold on to. "It's all right," he said, voice low. "God is our refuge and strength, an ever-present help in trouble." Psalm 46:1. The words felt heavier than he'd spoken them in years. Not a sermon, not a habit, but a vow. Another contraction gripped her, pulling her forward. He took her arm, guiding her toward the one room he had kept closed all this time. The door creaked as if in protest, revealing the bed against the far wall, a rocking horse in the corner, and sunlight spilling through the window in a way that made dust dance like pollen. John steadied her as she lowered herself onto the quilt. He adjusted the pillow beneath her head, smoothed the hair from her face, and then pulled a chair close enough that she could hold his hand. Outside, the wind rattled the shutters again. The hills beyond were silent, watchful, as if they too understood that nothing beyond this point would be the same. Hours blurred into each other, measured only by Clara's breathing, sometimes sharp, sometimes slow, always pulling her deeper into the work her body was made to do. John kept the fire hot, kept the water warm, and stayed close enough for her to reach him without asking. She gripped his hand so tightly at one point that he thought he felt the bones shift, but he didn't move. Pain had to go somewhere, and if it could run into him for a while, he'd take it. The air in the room grew heavy, thick with heat and the faint scent of cedar from the linens. Outside, a branch scraped the window in time with her breaths, like the land itself was listening. Then, in the hush between contractions, it happened. The room filled with a sound unlike any other. Not the crack of ice or the call of coyotes, but a cry. Small, fierce, alive. It was a sound that seemed to push the shadows back into the corners. John worked quickly, almost afraid the moment might slip if he hesitated. He wrapped the tiny body in a flannel quilt, the same one that had once belonged to his son, and for a moment his hands stilled. Years of loss pressed in, threatening to unmake him. But when he looked down, the eyes looking back were new, untouched by anything that had come before. He carried the bundle to Clara. Her arms were trembling, but they opened without hesitation. He placed the child against her chest, feeling her body curl protectively around the weight of new life. She didn't speak at first. She only held him, one hand resting against the small back, feeling each breath. Her shoulders eased, and her face, still lined with exhaustion, softened into something he hadn't seen before. John stayed standing for a while, as if the ground beneath him had shifted. He glanced toward the window, where the last light of day spilled in gold over the snow. The hills stood quiet, the wind had gentled, and the cabin no longer felt like a place haunted by absence. Every good and perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of the heavenly lights, James 1:17. The verse rose in his mind without invitation, and for the first time in years he let it stay. The baby's cry softened into a steady rhythm, as if he'd already decided the world was worth staying in. John sat then, close enough that his knee brushed the bed frame, and let the sound settle into his bones. The fire had burned down to embers, a soft red glow that painted the walls in slow-moving shadows. Clara sat propped against the pillows, the quilt drawn around her, and the baby nestled in the crook of her arm. His tiny breath rose and fell in a rhythm that seemed to calm the room itself. John sat nearby, elbows resting on his knees, watching without intruding. He had no questions, not yet. Questions could wait. There were some moments too fragile to disturb. It was Clara who broke the silence. "I've been thinking about a name," she said quietly, eyes fixed on the sleeping child. John tilted his head. "Go on." "Jonah," she said, letting the sound linger in the air. The name landed between them like a stone dropped into still water, rippling outward. John thought of the old story, a man swallowed by darkness, certain it was the end, only to be delivered into the light again. "Because he survived?" John asked. Clara's gaze flicked to his, steady now. "Because we both did. And because second chances don't come easy. When they do, you take them." He nodded, the corner of his mouth tightening. It was a name that belonged to resilience, to the stubborn refusal of life to let go. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Outside, snowmelt dripped from the eaves in slow, deliberate drops. Somewhere in the pasture, the mare shifted her weight and snorted into the cold air. John reached out, not to touch the child, but to rest his hand lightly on the edge of the quilt. "Jonah Merrick," he said, testing the sound. "It fits." Clara smiled. Not wide, not showy, but the kind of smile that hinted at something beginning to mend inside her. "It fits," she agreed. The baby stirred, letting out a small noise that was almost a sigh. Clara brushed a fingertip over his cheek, then looked back at John. "You've lost before," she said, not as a question, but as a fact. He didn't flinch. "Yes." "And yet you stayed," she murmured, "even when it hurt to." John didn't answer, but in the quiet that followed, the truth settled between them. Staying was its own kind of courage. Jonah shifted again, his tiny hand curling around the fabric of the quilt. Clara leaned down and pressed her lips to his forehead, whispering the name once more like a prayer. By late March, the grip of winter began to loosen. Snow still lingered in the shaded folds of the hills, but the creek ran faster now, swollen with meltwater that caught the sunlight in sudden flashes. The air carried a damp, earthy smell, the scent of ground waking up after a long sleep. John had moved Jonah's cradle to the front room, where the boy could feel the warmth of the fire and see the soft light through the windows. Clara kept him swaddled in the mornings, but let him stretch and kick when the sun rose high. His cries were stronger now, less like a plea and more like a demand, a reminder that life here was no longer just about survival, it was about growing. Some days John worked the fence line while Clara sat under the cottonwood tree with Jonah in her lap, humming low. The tune was never quite the same, but it always seemed to calm the boy. John would glance up from his work and catch sight of them, two figures framed by the pale green of new leaves, and something inside him would settle. The land mirrored their slow healing. The frost that had hardened the soil was giving way to soft earth, ready for planting. The cattle moved further into the pasture, no longer bunched for warmth. Even the wind felt different, less like a warning, more like a companion passing through. One evening, as the last light spilled gold over the ridge, John found Clara standing by the fence, Jonah in her arms. She was watching the horizon, but not with the wary eyes she'd worn when she first arrived. This gaze was open, unguarded. "Snow's nearly gone," John said, leaning on the post beside her. Clara smiled faintly. "I used to hate spring. It meant more work. But now, it feels like a promise." They stood in easy silence, the kind that asked for nothing. Jonah stirred, opening his eyes briefly before drifting back to sleep. John glanced down at the boy. "He's strong." "He has to be," Clara replied. "So do we." The sun dipped lower, brushing the fields in amber. John felt the shift, not just in the season, but in himself. The cabin no longer carried the weight of things lost. It was filling with the presence of what had been found. The first real warmth of April had settled over the valley when John heard the sound of hooves on the main trail. It was a measured pace, steady but unhurried, the kind of ride that belonged to someone who knew the land. He stepped onto the porch, coffee mug in hand, just as Sheriff Cole Hart came into view. The man rode with his shoulders loose, hat tipped low against the sun. When he reached the bend in the road that passed the Merrick place, he slowed his horse and glanced toward the cabin. For a long second, their eyes met. John gave the smallest nod. The sheriff returned it, then looked past him toward the barn. No searching gaze, no tallying details, just a man looking at another man's land and letting it be. Then, with a soft click of his tongue, he urged the horse forward. The sound of hoofbeats faded into the distance, swallowed by the hum of spring. Inside, Clara was at the table with Jonah in her lap, a small bundle of bright-eyed curiosity. She looked up when John stepped in. "Who was it?" she asked. "Just Cole," John replied, setting his mug down. Her brow tightened, just for a moment. "And?" "And nothing," John said simply. He rode on. Clara's shoulders dropped, the breath leaving her as if she'd been holding it for years. She bent her head and pressed a kiss to Jonah's hair. It wasn't just that the sheriff hadn't stopped, it was that he'd chosen not to. The past, all its weight and shadow, had no place here anymore. It would not cross the threshold unless they invited it, and they wouldn't. That night, as the light faded, John stepped outside to close the gate. The air was soft with the scent of thawing earth and the promise of rain. Somewhere in the distance, a meadowlark called, its song simple, unhurried, sure of its place in the world. When he came back in, Clara was by the window, rocking Jonah gently. Her eyes were not on the road, but on the field beyond, where the grass swayed in the last light. She didn't look like a woman waiting for anything anymore. John realized then that peace wasn't loud. It was quiet enough to miss if you weren't listening. The days grew longer, the light stretching across the hills as if the land itself were learning to breathe again. By late May, the grass along the creek stood high, bending in the wind, and the cottonwoods had filled out in full green. Every evening, after the last chore was done and Jonah had been fed, John lit the lantern. It was the same one he'd set in the window that first night Clara had come out of the creek, dripping and silent. Back then it had been a small act, maybe even unconscious. A light against the dark, in case someone needed to know the world hadn't shut its doors entirely. Now it had become something else. Some evenings, neighbors passing on the ridge would see it from the trail and tip their hats in the fading light. Travelers heading east toward Sheridan would glance down into the valley and spot the glow, steady and low, a reminder that there was a place here where a man or woman could stop and not be turned away. Clara never asked John why he kept the ritual, and John never explained. She simply took to trimming the wick and filling the oil before sunset, setting it near the porch rail where the glow carried far. Jonah, barely old enough to crawl, would sit in her lap and watch the flame dance as the night crept in. One evening, as John struck the match, Clara stepped beside him. She looked out over the fields, her voice quiet. "When I first saw this light, I thought it was just for you, maybe for your wife or your boy. Now I think, maybe it was always meant for more than that." John didn't answer right away. The match flared, the lantern caught, and the warm glow settled between them. "Light's meant to be seen," he said finally. "Otherwise it's just a flame in a jar." The words hung there, not heavy, just certain. They stayed on the porch until the last of the twilight faded, the lantern's glow pushing back the edges of the dark. Somewhere in the house, the quilt was folded over Jonah's cradle. The fire was banked low, and the walls that had once held only silence now held the sound of life, quiet, constant, and unafraid. If you like this video, please comment number 9. If you don't like it, please comment number 0. The years passed not in leaps, but in steady steps, measured by the height of the grass each spring, the way the cottonwoods thickened with each summer, and the slow, sure growth of a boy who had been born on a winter's edge. Jonah took to walking early and to running not long after. By 3, he could outpace Clara's reach when he set his mind to chasing the hens across the yard, his laughter carrying over the fence to where John worked with a post and mallet. The chickens clucked in indignation, scattering like leaves in the wind, but Jonah always circled back, triumphant and mud-spattered, to show his mother some new feather he'd found. Clara had taken to reading in the shade of the cottonwood, her skirts spread in the grass, a book open in her lap. Sometimes Jonah curled beside her, leaning against her arm while she traced her finger under the words. Other times he roamed the yard in great looping adventures, returning with pockets full of stones, sticks, and the occasional frog. John worked as he always had, mending the fence line, oiling the hinges on the barn doors, checking the roof before the rains came. But the work felt different now. The rhythm of his days was no longer the hollow beat of survival. It was the heartbeat of something whole. The neighbors noticed the change too. Where once the Merrick place had been a quiet shape on the ridge, now there was life in it. Laundry hung in the breeze, wood smoke curling steady from the chimney, and a boy's voice calling across the pasture. Travelers on the trail still saw the lantern at dusk, but now they also saw the glow of the windows, the hint of movement inside. Cain was never heard from again. Wade Foster, the bounty hunter, sent a single letter the next spring. Nothing inside but a pressed violet and the words, "Mercy keeps its own accounts." The sheriff kept his peace. The past, it seemed, had finally stopped knocking. Some evenings after supper, John would lean on the porch rail, watching Jonah weave between the fence posts, pretending they were enemies in need of vanquishing. Clara would call him in before the dark, her voice carrying over the yard like a bell. And John, standing there in the fading light, would think about the man he had been when she first came. A man shut in, looking backward at what was gone. Now he found himself looking forward, toward the next planting, the next thaw, the next set of small footprints in the dust. The fences would always need mending, storms would always roll in from the west, but the Merrick place was no longer a house for ghosts, it was a home. Evening always came the same way, first the sun slipping low over the ridge, then the hills turning to shadows, and finally the slow bloom of starlight above the valley. On nights when the air was still, you could hear the creak from the porch, its voice carrying soft over the grass. John and Clara had settled into a rhythm that didn't need words to be understood. After supper, John would draw 2 rocking chairs close to the rail. Clara would bring Jonah out in her arms, the boy already heavy with sleep, his cheek pressed against her shoulder. They'd sit there together, the boards creaking gently under their weight, the lantern's glow painting a warm circle around them. Some nights Clara hummed, not the restless tunes she'd once sung to herself in the barn, but melodies that rose and fell like the wind in the cottonwoods. Other nights they said nothing at all, letting the quiet hold them. Jonah's breathing was slow, steady, a small anchor in the cool night. John would glance down at him, seeing in the boy's face a life that had no memory of flight, fear, or hunger. He thought about the truth of it, that family wasn't always something you were born into. Sometimes it was something you chose, every day, in 100 small ways. Clara shifted slightly, tucking the quilt tighter around Jonah. "Do you ever think about before?" she asked quietly. John nodded once. "Sometimes, but not the way I used to." She tilted her head toward him. "I used to live back there," he said, gesturing behind him as if pointing toward some invisible horizon. "Now I just remember, and I'm thankful." Clara looked out over the fields, her lips curving in a faint smile. "I never thought I'd be safe like this, not really." John reached for her free hand, his fingers rough against hers. "You are." They sat in silence for a while longer, the stars brightening overhead. Somewhere in the dark, an owl called. "If anyone is in Christ, he is a new creation. The old has gone, the new has come." 2 Corinthians 5:17. The verse came to John's mind the way a path appears under a lantern's light, not all at once, but enough to see the next step. And maybe that was all faith was, taking the next step, even if you couldn't see the end of the road. The lantern burned steady at their feet, its light spilling onto the porch and out into the night. It was the same light Clara had seen years ago when she stumbled out of the creek, bruised and cold. It was the same light travelers saw now from the trail, a sign that there was shelter here if you needed it. The Merrick place wasn't perfect, There would be storms, sickness, and the slow wear of years. But as long as the lantern was lit, there would be a home. John rocked gently, the boards groaning under him, and felt Jonah's small foot twitch against his arm. Clara leaned into him, her head resting on his shoulder. In that moment, with the night around them and the light between them, John knew the truth. You don't just keep a home by locking its doors. You keep it by keeping the promise that anyone who comes to it will find the door open. And some promises, once made, you keep for life.